Now we come to the time when we're going to be looking at what I call the sermon content document. You're going to hear me say this a lot, especially in class, about the sermon content document. Some would call this a manuscript, but in reality it's not a manuscript in that you're not writing a full word-for-word manuscript of what you're going to say when you actually preach. But when you think about preaching these passages, preaching your passage, preaching the passage that you've just been studying, you're now to the point where you've got a lot of exegetical data. You have data from your textual observations, your significant word study, from your diagram, from the history and culture background. You've accumulated a lot of data, what I call data, about the passage and details within the passage. And you've worked towards this what, why, how, your primary matters. And I told you that if you have a very clear answers to your what, why, and how, you will be able to see the structure of your sermon. It's not the fullness of your sermon, but it provides that skeleton structure. It's what your sermon, if you want to call it this, think of the what, why, how as the bones of the body, and the sermon content document, you're going to put the flesh around the bones. And you'll use the data that you learned from your exegesis to help you put the flesh on the bones. And so when you think about composing a sermon, I want you to get into your mind this idea of sermon content document. Sermon content document. That is what you're going to create. And if you do this well, you can actually bring this document to the pulpit with you when you take your Bible and open it up to preach. You don't have to. You don't have to bring a document like that. But that is what I'm wanting you to produce. So call it your pulpit notes. Call it your content notes. Whatever you want to call it, it doesn't matter. The reality is the sermon content document is going to represent the flow and the structure of what you're going to say to your people as you preach the passage that you have been studying. And so when you look at your notes here, one of the first things you see is an overview of the structure of your sermon. I call it an overview of steps. When you think of a sermon, when you think of your sermon, there's three major components when you compose a sermon. There is the introduction, there is the body, and there is the conclusion. It's always three major sections. And each section functions together. Even though they're independent sections in your structure or flow of your sermon, they all function together. You cannot begin your sermon with a body with the body only. You got to have an introduction first, and then you got to have a conclusion afterwards. So your sermon is developed along these lines. So when you see this overview, you'll see introduction, and then you'll see down below the body, and then you'll see down below that the conclusion. And I want to just briefly go over this overview with you, and I'm going to explain each step within the introduction, each step of the body, each step of the conclusion. I'm going to explain each one of these in detail. But I want you to first just look at the overview of it. So you have introduction, body, conclusion. Introduction comes first, body comes second, conclusion is the last part of the process. So every sermon, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, no matter how long you preach, you may be one of those hour-and-a-half preachers. You always follow the pattern of introduction, body, conclusion. So when you look at the introduction, there are 7 steps here. Get the attention of the hearers. Surface the need for the hearers. Describe the contemporary situation. Describe the historical situation. Raise questions for the hearers. Read the passage. And then transition to the body. Now again, I'm going to explain later on each of these categories or each of these steps, whatever you want to call them. But what I want you to see is that you walk through these in that order. But when you have introduction, I want you to follow this as a pattern for the structuring of your sermon. I want you to you don't begin with raising questions and then get the attention of the hearers. You don't do it that way. You don't start by reading. Most of you may be used to that, but I want you to try working it this way. Follow these steps, and follow these steps in the order in which they're given, in the order in which I laid them out for you. Why am I doing this? Why am I telling you to do this? Why am I encouraging you to do this? It's because if you follow this pattern, if you follow these steps in this order, structure your words, what you're going to say in terms of this format, I think it will help you better communicate the passage that you have been studying. It'll help you better communicate the meaning to the passage that you have been studying and been exegeting. One thing about the introduction, and as you hear me describe each of these categories, each of these steps later, one of the things you're going to notice is that in the introduction, that is where your what and your why of your primary matters, your subject and matter and your contextual matter, where your what and your why, you deal with those two questions, the answers to those two questions. They become evident in your introduction. That's when you begin to speak about those things. And if you walk through these steps as I have them listed, you're going to be better able to communicate the what and the why. Now, after the introduction, you have the body. And you notice here, there's statement number 1, and then you see statement number 2, statement number 3, and add additional statements as needed. Each of those statements, that represents your how. Remember, what, why, how? The what and the why are delivered. You speak about those things in your introduction. The how shows up in the body of your sermon. Each of those how statements, how many do you have? You may have 3, you may have 4, you may have 5, you may only have 2. But ever how many you have, each one of those goes in the body section of your sermon. And so, for example, statement number 1, that would represent your first how statement that you stated or that you wrote down in your primary matters. Now look at what you do for each one of the statements. You have to do 5 things. Number 1 is explanation. Then it's illustration. Then it's argumentation. And then it's application. For each one of these, and then you have to transition to the next statement. For each one of these, explanation, illustration, argumentation, application, and even the transition comes at the end before you go to the next statement. But those 4 elements, this is different than what I just said about the introduction. In the introduction, you walk through those steps in order. In the body, when it comes to those 4 areas of explanation, illustration, argumentation, application, and again, I'm going to explain each one of those and what those represent. The point I want to make here is that they may be in different orders. You may be explaining, and then you illustrate, then you apply, and then you may explain some more, and then you may do argumentation, and then you may illustrate some things. And so it's not going to be like you do all your explanation, and then all your illustration, and then all your argumentation, and all your application, and that's it. And you're done with your first how statement. It may not work like that. Now, when we have class meetings together, I'm going to show you different examples in class. I'm going to show you, while we're meeting together in class, I'm going to show you different examples of passages where if you're preaching this passage, you're going to explain a little bit, then illustrate, then maybe apply, then you maybe explain some more, and then maybe you're going to argue here, and then illustrate, So these could be in any kind of order. Normally you do start with explaining first. That is usually where you start. But again, I'm going to explain each of these categories. I'm going to describe each of these categories for you later on. But I want you to see that these 4 categories plus the transition, this is what you work through when it comes to composing your sermon when you're trying to go through each of your how statements. And you notice here, statement number 1, you have those 5 steps. Statement number 2, you have the same 5 steps. Statement number 3, the same 5 steps. You just keep working through that same process over and over and over again for all of your how statements. And you add additional how statements as needed. Now, when you're at your last and final how statement, instead of transitioning to the next detail matter, then you're moving from that to the conclusion. So you're not having to transition to another detail matter. You just are making the transition to the conclusion. And that brings up the final of the 3 categories. So you started with the introduction, body, now conclusion. And you'll notice here there's 4 main steps. Appeal to the hearer's sense of logic and feelings, summarize the passage, state the action required by the hearers, and make a direct appeal for obedience to the hearers. Now these 4 steps, just like the introduction, need to be done in that order, need to be completed in that order. So the introduction and the conclusion areas of your sermon have a list of steps for each one of them, and you follow those steps in that order. And again, I'm going to describe each of these steps in more detail to let you know what each one represents. When it comes to the body, though, however, you can take those 4 categories of explanation, illustration, argumentation, application, and you may repeat some of them. They may be in different kinds of orders. You have flexibility there. But when it comes to the introduction and conclusion, you follow this structure in the order in which it's given. And even overall, even in the body, you always, every statement you're going to make when you're explaining or describing one of your how statements, when you're in that discussion, you're either going to be explaining, illustrating, arguing, or applying. And so you're going to be doing one of those 4 things. And when you're in your introduction and conclusion, you're going to be walking through those steps in that particular order. So in your introduction, you're presenting your what and your why. In your body, you're presenting the how statements. And in conclusion, you're just wrapping up everything and making the final application to your audience, to your hearers, and encouraging them and challenging them and telling them they need to follow this biblical truth that's taught in your passage. So that's just an overview of the process. And I'm going to explain each category. I'm going to describe it for you. And in class, we're going to be looking at examples of passages. I'm actually going to preach a couple of sermons to you in class while we're meeting together and let you see an example of a sermon that comes from an exegesis of a passage. So I'm going to do that. But this provides for you, at least initially, an overview of what you'll be doing in terms of the structure for your sermon as you compose your sermon content document. Now we're going to look at each category and that's in the introduction, the body, and conclusion. And I'm going to define for you each of those categories. So the first category under the introduction, we're going to start with the introduction. This is where you begin When you're preaching, you begin in the introduction, so let's begin there as well. The first category to look at is getting the attention of the hearers. Getting the attention of the hearers. You must not assume that your hearers are alert and eager to hear what you have to say. You may want to think that. You may want to think that they're very eager and they really desire to hear what you're going to preach and what you're going to say. But in most cases, they're not. And just assume that. Your hearers are probably, what's going on is they're preoccupied with their own personal concerns, with what's going on in their daily life. They could either be tired or maybe bored, or they may be suspicious that you're actually going to make their day worse than better. And you say, well, why would they even come to church? It's just because this is what they do. And so not everybody is just excited about hearing you preach. There may be some. You would want everybody to be. But the reality is they're just not. And so you need to accept that. And so your first thing that you're going to try to do is get their attention. Get their attention. From your very first words, what you're trying to do is you're aiming at arresting the attention of your hearers. And what you want to have them focus upon at the very, very initial stage, just in your opening remarks, is you want them to be acquainted with your subject matter and your contextual matter, the what and the why. So usually one of the best ways to start, the best ways to open up is maybe provide some kind of illustration. Some kind of story, real-to-life story, or something that they can relate to that complements the subject matter of the passage. So, for example, if your passage is about love, and 1 Corinthians 13, it's all about what Paul's talking about is love, then deal with some aspect of the issue of love. Something that would bring that to life. So they can not just hear you talk about love as a concept, but they can see the picture of it. And that's one way you can begin. There are other ways you can get the attention of the hearers. You can talk about the seriousness of whatever that subject matter is. But you want to find a way in your opening remarks, in your opening words, of getting them to focus their attention upon you, the speaker. You're the communicator. You're the one that's trying to tell them for the next 30 to 45 minutes to an hour, it's important that you listen to what I have to say from the Bible. And so you want them to focus upon your words and what you're going to say. You want to grab their attention. Now, there are ways you can do this. We're going to talk about sermon delivery in the next video. And there's things you want to do from a sermon delivery standpoint that can help you get the attention of your hearers and keep it. But here I'm more focused on what you actually say, the content of your words. You want to provide a way to already begin to introduce to them the concept of whatever the what is and the why. And again, an illustration becomes a good way to do that. Now, there are ways you can get their attention. There's ways that you want to avoid getting their attention. You know, you don't want to just go up to the pulpit, to the podium, and start doing something that's weird just to get their attention. You know, you don't want to do anything that's crazy. But what you want to do is think about your wording. Think about what you're going to say and how you're going to say it. And start at the very beginning, captivating their mind on what is the subject matter of the text. Now in class, we're going to be looking at this in terms of examples. I'm going to preach a couple of sermons to you from passages, and you'll see how I do this, how I attempt to get your attention in class when I'm preaching to you. And so we're going to model this for you and give you some help in understanding how to think about this aspect of the introduction. But the first thing you want to work at is getting the attention of the hearers. After that, you want to surface the need for the hearers. Now, this should go right into, or you should be able to work right into, from getting their attention into surfacing the need. You should be able to flow right into that. And surfacing the need for the hearers, what that is you can look at your notes here. Since people are usually interested in whatever touches their own personal concerns, you must show how the subject matter of the text and the contextual matter of the text, how those two things relate to their life. This is what we call surfacing the need. You want to take that subject matter and contextual matter before you ever talk about the text itself and bring it into their world. And why should they be listening to you today? It's called surfacing the need. You must help your hearers truly see how that subject matter and that contextual matter fits their present day situation. Where does it meet them in real life? Where does it meet them where they live? In the world in which they live. They don't live in the same world you do. You live in the world of books and study and preaching and pastoring. They live in a different world. They may be a taxi driver. They may be work for a company. They may have to deal with all kinds of things that you don't have to deal with every day. Their world is a little bit different. And you got to take that timeless truth, that subject matter and contextual matter, and you got to bring it into their world and make it speak to their world. And we call that surfacing the need. And again, in class, we're going to show you how to do this. We're going to show you how to word statements in such a way that after you get their attention, that you flow right into surfacing the need and help them see how what the subject and the why, the what and the why, the subject and the contextual matter, how that meets their life and hits them right where they live. Because if you do this well, you're getting them acclimated, getting them focused to the point where they will hear you when you actually go through the passage and you expound on the what, the why, and the how. They're going to actually be now wanting to listen to you. Before, at the beginning, we weren't sure if they were going to listen to you or not, or if they even wanted to. They're maybe thinking, oh, another boring sermon from my pastor. That could be going on through their mind. And you want for them not to think that way. You want them to be captivated by the reality of the truth that you're going to preach that particular Sunday. So you start with getting their attention, and then you work towards surfacing the need, relating the subject matter and the contextual matter to their present day life. Now the next category, and again you would flow from surfacing the need into this next one, I call it describe the contemporary situation. It is true that the human element is a vital factor for the entire work of composing the sermon. You preach because the Lord called you to preach to your people for their benefit. So what you want to do when you get to this section in the introduction, you want to think about how this text speaks directly to life experience of the listener. So this flows directly out of the surfacing the need. The surfacing the need, you're getting very personal with them. And then when you describe the contemporary situation, you're saying, look, this is very important for each of us. It's very important that we learn how to love, that we know that it's a priority to love one another and care for one another. Look at our world. Look at the contemporary situation around us. Look at the way people are in our world. People have hate for one another. The world is filled with hate. And so what I'm doing is I went from surfacing the need to describing the contemporary situation. And I could expound on that a little bit more, but you see what we're doing here. You want to kind of broaden the scope a little bit from getting very personal and say, look at the world that you live in. Look at the world that surrounds you. This is the kind of world that we live in. And maybe make some specific things about how the world opposes the truth you're going to preach about. Think about the subject matter, the what and the why, And how different is the world opposed to that? How different does the world live in contrast to that in the present day? So you want to describe the contemporary situation. And then that flows you right into the next step, which is describe the historical situation. So now you're taking the listener back to the first century, or to where that passage was originally read by the original audience. What group of people did that passage apply to when it was first written? So what would it be like for the church at Ephesus, or the church in Rome, to hear these words read, the letters that Paul wrote? Describe not only the contemporary situation, but go into that historical situation. And so you want to make sure that the hearers understand this historical and cultural situation that existed during the time when that passage was written. That's why we had you do the history and cultural assignment. I wanted you to make sure that you had that exegetical data, because here's where that's going to pay off. Here's where you're going to be able to take that information you learned and state it in such a way that that your people can relate that, wow, not only do we have this need for this issue today, it was also a need back in the day in which it was first written. Times really, in one sense, have not changed. The same love of God that people should have for each other, yes, it's for today, but it was also for back then. And so you want to describe the historical situation. But you want to present this information, though, this historical information, in such a way that your hearers do not sense that you're just lecturing to them. Usually it goes like this. Here's what the preacher will do. The preacher will say, okay, well, let me give you a little background to the passage. I want to give you a little background. You don't use the word background. In the class, when we meet together, I'm going to show you how the best way to transition, to flow from describing the contemporary situation to describing the historical situation, without it seeming so formula, without it seeming so like you're changing the direction of the sermon. That really they flow together. They flow one into the other very seamlessly. Why is this important? Because if you start speaking like a lecturer giving a history lesson, people will, you have to get their attention again. And you don't want to do that. You want to keep their attention already. And so it's how you present this is going to be a challenge. You want to help them relate to the situation that took place back in the biblical days, but you don't want this to come across like it's a boring history lesson. So in the class, I'm going to show you how to do this. I'm going to give you the help that you need of how to transition from one to the other. That's why it's important to be in the class, to attend, so that I can describe this to you, or your professor can describe this to you, how this works. So again, you go through these steps in this order. Now at this point, after you describe that historical situation, now you want to raise questions to the hearers, or for the hearers. At this point, if they've really been focused on you and focused on what you're saying, if they really have been tracking with you, they probably have questions in their mind about how does all this work? How does this work for me? And what Paul says in this passage, or Peter says in his passage. And this is at the place where you can raise questions for your hearers to think about as you are going to get close to transitioning from the introduction to the body of the sermon. You want to word these questions to help engage your hearers so that they can anticipate the answers that will be provided in the body of the sermon. So these questions, what they do, the way they function, is that they allow the hearer, it allows you to communicate to the hearer and probe them for them to think it through. One example would be like this. If we're talking about the issue of love in 1 Corinthians 13, and Paul's issue there, the subject matter is the what is love. The why, the contextual matter, is about the priority of love, the supremacy of love. And you could say something in your sermon at this point about that. You know, let's imagine that you've gone through all the other steps, and you get to the point of raising questions, and you could ask questions something like this. You could ask them, is it important? Is it a priority? Is love really a priority in your life? Do you see that if you don't love others, that you're missing the mark of how important that is from what we know, from what Scripture teaches us? What Paul's going to say here in 1 Corinthians 13, he's going to challenge us and encourage us to make sure that loving each other is a priority in our life. And he's going to show us how supreme love is over everything else. Do you see how supreme it is? I'm asking you, do you see how supreme it is? I want you to see that. I want you to know that. I want you to see the reality of that. Now, let me read the passage to you. And then we're going to look at this passage and see how Paul talks about and addresses the issue of the superiority of love. You see, I raised some questions. I began to probe them, and that led me to reading the passage. And when I say read the passage, you don't just read the passage by itself with just in any kind of tone. You read with passion and purpose. At this point is when you want to read the passage. You're kind of gotten their focus. You've gotten them to focus on you. You've walked them through the process to the point where now they're ready to get these questions resolved. They're ready to have their questions answered. They're ready to see the solution to the issue. And that's when you want to read the passage to them. When now they want to follow you. Now they will follow along with what you have to say. Now you've captivated them. And you read it in such a way that you read it with purpose and passion. And in the classroom, I'm going to show you how to do that. It's no tricks or anything. It's all about the emotion of it. I'm going to help you tap into the emotion of the passage and be able to relate to that and be able to preach in such a way or read in such a way that the text in such a way that it communicates. Even just reading it will communicate to you or communicate to them. Now, after you've read the passage with passion and purpose, the final area that you cover in the introduction section is the transition to the body. And this will be a series of statements where you will prepare your hearers for the exposition of those verses, of the specific verses in your passage that you will cover in the body of the sermon, and that's covered by the how statements. All the verses that came from your how statements when you labeled those in the primary matters. You're going to have a transition. And this is not like one simple statement. This will be a series of statements. And how the transition works is very important. It's not the same in all cases. And in the class, I'm going to show you how to do that. So you have these steps. You want to work through each of these steps. We'll show you in class how to work through them, and I'll model them for you. And now, after that, we'll go to the next section, the body of the sermon. Now, the body of the sermon, there are 5 categories that you have to look at. And remember when I told you that these categories, you don't have to just do everything for each category and move forward. These will be mixed up, and I'll show you how that works in class when we meet in class. But let me define each of the categories for you and at least get you acquainted with what each one represents. So when you think about the body, this is for each how statement, okay? So for each how statement, one of the things you got to do is explain. It's called explanation. Here, you want to explain how your text is the basis for the principles you state in your outline. You may also want to explain further what you meant by your statement. And it's here where you will go to the text and you'll point to significant words and phrases to help your hearers understand the detailed matters of the text. So when it comes to the explanation section of your in the body, so for each house statement, just imagine one of your house statements. You state it as you have written it. And now these verses, that's your support for that. And so your support the verses have to actually teach what you just said. And so what you want to do is, as you work through the verses, whenever you're explaining something or bringing up the meaning of a word or a phrase and how things relate together. Remember from the diagram, you saw how phrases connected with each other in terms of word studies, significant words. You looked at significant words and found the meaning of those words. And then you did textual observations and you saw words that repeat and different things of that nature. You know, when you think about explanation, what that is just explaining the meaning of that. Helping your people to understand the meaning of these words and phrases. And again, in class, I'll model this for you. I'll show you how to do this and how this works. When you hear me preach in class and I give you a sample sermon, you're going to be able to you'll be able to say to yourself, oh, he's explaining at this point. He's giving explanation at this point in the statements that he's making. But the explanation area is you got to give out the meaning of the words and the phrases and how it all connects together. So that's one of the categories in the body. The next category is illustration. This component serves to clarify the textual truth in the mind of the hearer by using various images that your hearers would understand. It's similar to what you may want to open up with an illustration at the beginning of the sermon. Remember I talked about that in getting the attention of the hearers? Well, illustrations at this point can serve to better clarify the truth that you're preaching on. You may want to tell another real-to-life story or another biblical passage. Illustrations can be varied, and we'll talk in class about illustrations more in depth and analyze the types of illustrations. We'll do that in our class time and spend some time focusing more on illustrations and where do illustrations come from? How are the best ways to come up with illustrations? But that's another category. So you got explanation, illustration. Illustration is what helps the explanation. It provides clarity to that which you have explained in terms of working through the passage. Now the next category may be difficult to understand, but I call it argumentation. Argumentation. This doesn't mean that you're going to argue the text, okay? Or that you got to get in an argument with someone. I'm not meaning it in that way. But think about this. Sermons are designed by its very nature to persuade the hearer to a specific course of belief and a specific course of action, right? If Paul is talking about love in 1 Corinthians 13, he wants the Corinthians to love each other. He's doing this for a reason. He's writing about this for a reason. He's not just writing about it just so because he wants to put a pen down on a sheet of paper. He's got a purpose, a practical purpose in mind for the readers of that letter, for that church. When you preach, you have a particular reason for why you want to get across the message that God has laid on your heart from the passage that you've studied. Sermons are designed to be persuasive in nature. What the argumentation component gives you is it helps you to give out the reasons for accepting the principles that are contained in the text. So how does this look when you're actually preaching? How does this work? Well, we'll talk about it again more in depth in class. You'll see many examples of it. But the idea is something like this. If you're talking about love, about Paul saying, talking about the supremacy of love, in the first section there in 1 Corinthians 13, he talks about how I could have the gift of miracles, I could have all the gifts, I could have enough to even move a mountain. I could have all faith and have every gift imaginable. But if I do not have love, I'm nothing. I'm just a loud like a loud clanging cymbal. I'm making a bunch of noise, but I really don't have any substance to me. And one of the ways you could argue that point to your hearer, make them relate to it, make them think about it. It's kind of the bridge between explaining before you get to application. You're trying to convince them of the reality of that. And you could say something like this. Do you see what Paul's saying here? Do you see the reality of what Paul's dealing with? He's saying to them, I could have every gift imaginable. I could be able to have so much faith and so many spiritual gifts, I could even move mountains. But if I don't have the gift of love, or if I don't love each other, if I don't love one another, if I'm not obeying that simple command, it really means nothing. It really means nothing. My life means nothing. All of my faith and all of my beliefs and all of my gifts mean nothing if I don't have love. Do you see how common sense that is? Can you relate to what Paul's saying? Do you see the reality of that? Do you see the importance of that? And so what I'm trying to do in this argumentation is I'm trying to give them the reasons for accepting and believing that. I'm trying to make them think about it. And in that case, I'm giving them a series of questions. There's other ways to do this. And we'll look at that in the class when we have our class time together. But it's argumentation. And then the next category is application. Application. What you're doing here is you're presenting the implications of the biblical truth for your hearers, in that you're exhorting them to put the principles of the passage to work in their life. You want them to actually do it. You want them to actually go out there and live your life according to this principle, according to what the Bible teaches. Make it real in your life. What this component deals with is attitudes, behavior, speech, lifestyle, personal identity. It appeals to the conscience, to the values, the convictions, and to their commitment to Christ. And here it's important to apply. It's important to make application. Give them something that they can take from your sermon, so that they know what to do in regards to what you've taught them. And sometimes the application just flows from the passage. I mean, sometimes the application is within the passage itself. But even if it's not explicitly stated, it's very easy to apply. Some preachers will say, oh, we never can apply. We should not apply the passage. We let the Holy Spirit do that. Yeah, the Holy Spirit will apply the passage, but the Holy Spirit will use you to help them to apply the passage. And so you want to be aware of that. The Holy Spirit can prompt you as the preacher. You're the pastor for the people. You're their shepherd. God wants you to shepherd them. And you shepherd them in many ways. Part of it is through your preaching. And this is a time when you can take that truth that you've been proclaiming, that you have studied, and now you're proclaiming it, make it real. Give them ways of implementing that in their life. That is application. Well, the next category is transitioning. Here you want to transition from one statement, your first or second or third house statement, to the next one that comes. And I wouldn't make this a formula, but one of the best things you want to do is think through the best way to transition from one to the next. Usually one of the ways I like to do it is by repeating. I'll say, Paul has stated this, and he's also stated this. Now, let's take a look at the third item in his list, and then I'll state what that is. So that's one way to do it. There's different ways you can transition, and again, we'll model different ways to do it in class, talk about it a little bit more in detail, but you want to think about transitioning. And so you have to transition from one statement to the next, from the second statement to the third, from the third to the fourth, and when you have your last body statement or your last house statement within the body of your sermon, then you're transitioning to the conclusion, which is the final area of your sermon. And now, so as we get to the conclusion of the sermon, now you're in your final section. of the sermon. There are 4 main categories here that you have to work through. And this is like the introduction. You kind of work through this pattern in this order. First is appeal to the hearer's sense of logic and feelings. Now here, what you're doing here is this component is where you appeal to the logical reasoning capability of your hearers to understand the implications of the biblical truth that you've been preaching on. What you're trying to do here is help your hearers to imagine what their lives would be like if they would believe the principles that you've been preaching that come from the passage and obeyed that truth that comes from the passage. If they believed it and obeyed it. So here you're painting a picture for them. And you're appealing to their sense of ability to understand and reason and to feel. And you're trying to give them, imagine with me if this were true. If you followed these principles, if you believed them in your heart and followed them, what would your life be like? Here you're putting the positive spin on it. You're trying to paint a beautiful picture of what their life could be like if they just simply would follow or believe and follow, obey what you've been preaching on. And so you want to have a series of statements that describe that. And again, in class, like I've been saying, we're going to be dealing with this. I'm going to show you many examples of this, how to think through what you would say to do this. But you need to appeal to their sense of logic and feelings. And then that leads into summarizing the passage. Summarizing the passage. Here's where you restate all your how statements. And you want to add any summary statements that you feel are necessary. You always want to make sure that before you say your final prayer and close, that you've restated all the how statements and kind of briefly summarized each one. And that's what you do at this point. You summarize the passage. Now the third category, what you're going to do is state the action required by the hearers. State the action required by the hearers. This component is where you describe specific, concrete steps of action your hearers might take from hearing the sermon. You say, I thought we've already applied as we went through the body. You did. But here you may want to go back to some of those application points and readdress them. Maybe say them again. Maybe use different wording. But you want to label out some specific and concrete steps of action. Give them an action plan of how to implement this truth in their life. You could provide a practical summary of applications, like you said, like I've already said, that you've already provided in the body of the sermon. You can go back and re-enhance those, add to those, re-emphasize those. But you want to think about that aspect right before you're getting near the end of your conclusion. Now the final category is make a direct appeal. Make a direct appeal for obedience to the hearers. This is where you challenge them. After you've given them specific steps, you've summarized the passage, you've appealed to their sense of logic and ability to reason and their feelings and painted a picture of what it would be like to believe this and follow this and summarize it for them again. Give them specific ways in which they can apply this. Now challenge them and exhort them to do it, to be obedient, to apply the meaning that comes from that passage, to make that application. And we know that the Holy Spirit's the one that will work in their hearts to do that which God would have them to do. We got to trust God to actually do the work. But our job is to make sure they know it. Make sure they hear it with their ears. Make sure they hear that they need to be exhorted. Paul would do this. The apostles did this. Christ did this. Exhorted them to make sure they hear and follow and obey. And you want to provide that exhortation. Now, the question gets asked, how much time do you devote to introduction, body, and conclusion? How much time do you allocate? Well, that's a discussion I want to have in the classroom with you guys. But just to give you some thoughts, the body of your sermon's where the bulk of your time is going to be. I'll be honest with you. But you may not be able to limit introduction to 5 minutes and then conclusion to 3 minutes. Don't think, actually, in one sense, don't think about the time. Just think about perspective. Your body's where the focus of your time is going to be. And your introduction and conclusion are going to have smaller amounts of time. But you still got to make sure you cover your steps, the necessary steps in that order. Honestly, when you think about the timing of things and writing out the timing, that's more a question for your sermon delivery. And we're going to talk about sermon delivery in the next video. But you want to think about the idea is that you're fulfilling all the steps throughout the process. The point of the whole thing is that when you compose your sermon content document, which I want you to compose a document of about 6 pages. And I'm going to show you how to do that in class. But it's going to have on there your introduction, your body, conclusion. And you're going to write your series of statements. And they're going to follow this pattern, this structure. And I think that will help you think in terms of being structured when you preach. It'll give you that guide that you need to help keep you focused, keep you on the right track, to make sure you're accomplishing the steps that are necessary. So you think of introduction, body, and conclusion. Now, one thing I want to mention briefly, and it's on the website, is a sermon. We're going to talk more about the sermons in class, but I want you just to take a look at the example here on the website. I've been working on the 1 Peter passage, been doing all the assignments on that, and here's the sermon. Here's the sermon. I call it Godly Character on Display. But we'll look at this more in detail. I'm actually going to preach this sermon in class for you guys. It'll be one of the sermons that I preach in class and walk through with you. And if you notice here, just look at the introduction, look at the body, and look at the conclusion. And you'll see a series of statements that I make. And I put it in like an outline format. But when you look at the introduction, you do not see all the categories listed, do you? They're just a series of statements. I don't actually list the categories and provide the statements. I don't do that for when I'm actually composing my sermon. But I'm using those steps. I'm walking through those steps in that order as I put together the introduction and as I put together the conclusion. When it comes to the body, I may be mixing it up a little bit. And so I may explain and then illustrate and then apply, and then I may argue, and then I may explain some more, then I may apply. They may go in different orders. And like I said, we'll talk more about that in class. But I want you to follow the pattern of the structure that I provided for you in introduction, body, conclusion. Walk through those steps in that order, and in the order I've told you, and then look at the sample sermon. And in class, we'll talk more about each of these categories. In class, I'll model things for you, model aspects of how you put all this together, preach a couple of sermons for you so you can see it done and you can actually see the pattern presented to you. Because we're going to be talking about sermon content and sermon content documents for a few weeks in our course. But take a look at this example, and hopefully it'll provide a help for you and get you ready for what you're going to be working on in terms of your sermon content documents. So you got a lot of work to do when it comes to writing a sermon. It takes some time. And I'll work with you to help you get it done. Your professor will work with you to help you get it done. And we'll provide you all kinds of information in the class, in our classroom time together, going more in depth into some of these areas and helping you ask questions and engage with your professor, with me, or whoever who your professor may be in regards to these aspects. But hopefully this has been helpful. And so the next session is going to be on delivery. So this session was all about what do you say. The next session is how do you say it. Both are important, It's not only what you say, it's how you communicate. And we'll be looking at that when we talk about sermon delivery in our next session together.